Okay, sorry for the delay, but now we're going to start. I introduce Laura Mojica, who is going to be next. And welcome, Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda. Well, thank you all for being here. It's surprisingly crowded. Yeah, I'm happy to see so many new faces and familiar faces as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk about psychological flexibility, the concept of psychological flexibility. And this is a project that I'm currently working on with my colleague, Mark James. For those of you who don't know Mark James, this is Mark James. And he's currently in Okinawa, that's why he's not here. He couldn't come and he cannot connect. It's way too early there. But together, we're trying to understand this concept of psychological flexibility using, of course, the tool from a radical embodied perspective. Our intuition is that it is a capacity to scaffold possibilities to build with others and effective possibilities to be opened. And sorry. Okay. 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 Yeah, it's fine. Okay. Yeah. So let me start talking about psychological flexibility. Of course, this notion is not something that either Mark or I invented. It's something that it's a notion that has been around for at least the last 20 years. It's gaining traction lately, both in the scientific community, among psychologists, and in popular science, and in science that become popular, and in popular advices that you read in magazines on how people should live a better life. And then it is said that being psychologically flexible is convenient for you. So in the more scientific psychological community, psychological flexibility is the central goal of certain kinds of therapy, which is called the acceptance and commitment therapy, which is being proposed among others, but this person, Hayes, and the idea is that to be psychologically flexible is to have the ability to contact the present moment, to be more fully in the present moment as a human being, and to change or persist in a behavior when doing so serves values and so is the ability to connect with what's currently happening and decide what is better for you according to some valuable end. This flexibility is currently seen as a personality trait, as a characteristic of individuals, and is usually talked about as if it was in the internal workings of people's minds, right? It's been shown already empirically that it has benefits for individual mental health and mental well-being. For example, it's been shown that it is good for coping. It's a good predictor for people coping better with early life trauma. And it's also a good predictor for people coping with trauma adversity that is currently happening as happened with the pandemics. So in general, being psychologically flexible is a good trait to have. It's something that we want to have, right? In the embodied approach, this idea has been taken as well. It has been understood usually in terms of habits. And to understand how it is understood, it's good to understand what is not to be psychologically flexible. So you are not psychologically flexible. There is some kind of inflexibility when you have rigid habits, which are patterns of affect or behavior and thought that have become so rigid that you are inflexible and it leads to dysfunction. This has been defended by many people. One of them is, for example, Susana Ramirez and Tom Closet. In the group here is from the house, let's say, and from some other people. They take the notion of habits to understand when things go right, as when you can be flexible, and when things go wrong, when you cannot be flexible. Okay, connected to this, and is something that is also being discussed in an activism, is that there is some evidence, growing evidence, that psychedelic therapy is an effective way of treating psychological inflexibility. It's effective and it's also safe when it's done in a therapeutical way. But it's not clear yet why this is the case. So some embodied approaches, and in particular the work of Inés Hipólito and her colleagues, have tried to show why this is effective, why this works, psychedelics work. So according to them, psychedelics act as the stabilizers of fixed points of attractors, which translates as the breaking of excessively reinforced or overweighted patterns of thinking and behaving. This is, in other words, putting the mind a bit more flat, so all the opportunities and the possibilities can be seen, and then you can choose there. The system can escape from the rigid patterns over time, and over time maybe explore some other possibilities of engaging in different ways, so different trajectories and different attractors. This opens the possibility of cultivating healthier ways of thinking and healthier ways of behaving. And another important part of this kind of therapy is that the experience itself of the psychedelic trip, let's say, it's also important for the healing. So yeah, okay, this is roughly what has been said. Okay, so that was the background, and what we would like to suggest together with Mark is a further explanation of this phenomenon that allow us to understand psychedelics, and as continues with other kind of phenomena that also contribute to well-being and that are instances of psychological flexibility. And we also want to account for the normative aspect of this concept. As I was telling you at the beginning, psychological flexibility is something that we want to have, something that is good for people. So we want to understand a little bit better why this is good. Again, normativity in this day. So the explanation that we want to develop is based on a theory that Tom has been developing recently. Maybe some of you have already heard of it, and it's called eruption theory. So eruption theory is a theory that Tom Froese proposed to account for the possibility of genuine subjectivity arising in nature. By genuine subjectivity, he means that agents, well, living creatures in general, cognitive agents, and us in particular, we have the possibility as agents to select among different courses of action, different trajectories. And one problem that he's been encountering over the years is that when you try to explain this phenomenon or cognitive phenomenon in terms of dynamical systems, these systems are deterministic systems. So there is not a real way of accounting for the possibility of selecting one thing or the other. That's also a problem for me, and that's why I take this framework, because if you cannot select between different courses of action, then there is no real sense of saying that you're acting right or wrong. So eruption theory this is a quote that explains roughly what he means. So in correct subjective involvement, this is the kind of involvement in which we see agency as opposed to deterministic systems, is indirectly observable as increased underdetermination of the body's physiological processes, akin to decreased physical constraints. Counterintuitively, eruptions do not entail random behavior. Rather, and this is the important part, they can facilitate behavioral switching and the self-organization of an implicit capacity for generalization, as indicated by models of complex and adaptive systems. So the idea here is not to throw completely dynamical systems, but to allow in some bubbles of underdetermination to explain for the possibility of switching. I meant these graphics to make it even more clear. So each of the lines are trajectories that can be explained and accounted by dynamical systems, as the story goes with embodied approaches. And then the eruptions that Tom is proposing are space in which the possibility of changing trajectory or changing attractor is open and is underdetermined. Okay, there are two important things here. And one is that eruptions are an intrinsic part of life, an intrinsic part of agency. So this happens to every form of life. And the other one is that there are various ways of amplifying these eruptions. So, for example, of course, again, this is work in progress, but the intuition behind is that a bacteria may have less eruption moments in which it can select from different trajectories, whereas as human beings have many instances of eruptions. So this is some. And then what we want to argue with Mark is that psychological flexibility, it's a matter of scaffolding these eruptions and scaffolding the right kind of eruptions. So to see this again, this is going to come back, but when you're psychologically flexible, you not only have the normal eruptions that everybody has, moments of being able to exert your agency, but you can scaffold these moments so you have more possibilities of selecting and therefore being flexible and adapting to situations. Okay, so these eruptions, as we see it, one of the things that is said at the beginning is that psychological flexibility, it's also a matter of being present in the moment. So when you have these eruptions, then the opening of the possibilities makes it more present, all the other possibilities that you can engage with that may not be so present when you are not so in contact with the moment. So that's why we like this idea of eruption. By doing that, by opening all these possibilities, one can facilitate the collaboration between subsystems or between different kinds of habits and the sensitivity to normative constraints that were not there before. So when this works together, when these eruptions happen and then things that were not working together start working together, this is manifested as flexibility, and it may allow the person to resolve some tensions that arise and enable certain adaptive responses. Let me see. Yeah. So one example of this, of course, is again, psychedelic therapy and ritualistic psychedelics, but there are also less intense activities, such as laughing. Laughing can be a kind of mini eruption that is not felt as intensely as psychedelics, but has this opening of possibilities. But I'll talk about it more. Okay. So one of the key concepts here is also that it is the right kind of eruptions. So we, of course, want to ask, what are those right kinds of eruptions? So what I want to argue here is that well-being is the foundations that is going to allow us to solve this normativity problem, that is going to tell us what is the kind right of eruption that is going to lead, that is the kind of eruption that we want to have. So, of course, the right kind of eruptions are those that contribute to individuals' well-being. And I have defended elsewhere, actually last week, if you're interested in seeing this, that well-being has three main components. One is a dignified life, and I define dignified life in terms of autonomy, an important concept for an activism, which refers to, so having a dignified life is having the ability to satisfy one's physiological needs and one's needs as a citizen, and to be able to execute these abilities routinely in the environment that one lives. So a dignified life means to be an autonomous agent that is able to, that has the skills to relate with the environment and maintain its identity and its life, basically, and to be in contact with, to be a citizen, let's say, to be part of the practices. A second component is possibilities of exploration, and this has two reasons behind. One is that it is good to explore, to develop its skills, and then to have more adaptive responses when circumstances change. But it's also, there is some joy in exploration by itself, and it's some joy that I think is inherent to life, and yeah, and it's enjoyable by itself. And the third element is that we need to have adequate affective dispositions to have a good life. By these adequate affective dispositions, I do not only mean like good, happy emotions and positive emotions. I also refer to all the moods and all the emotions that allow the agent to foster their own autonomy and the autonomy of others. So this is more oriented to action and to caring for oneself and caring for the others, rather than having positive emotions as it's been dependent in some proposals of well-being. So, okay, but as I told you, I defended this in some other talk. If you want to check that, or if you want to ask me, this is a matter of other talk. Here, I'm going to use it to tell you what is the right kind of eruption that defines psychological flexibility. So I will define these as affective eruptions, because psychological flexibility is a matter of affectivity. And yeah, so let's start here. So an affective eruption is a moment, as I show you, in which the possibilities of care are open. It's not about any kind of possibility, but possibilities of care about oneself and about the others. This means, in these kind of eruptions, this means that as possibilities open, that there is a moment of suspension of one's care. So one is not so focusedly invested caring about something like, let's say, my career, or one for a moment is not moved to act in the same way that one considers like the form in which one cares, for example, of one's own family, right? So one is not so invested in the routines and in the activity, and is not effectively moved to engage with them. This happens in a moment of eruption, and sometimes the felt sense of importance is gone from a moment of things mattering. When these eruptions are very intense, as it might be the case in psychedelic experiences, they can be experienced as an opening of opportunities and freedom that can felt either as lightness and freedom for some people, or it can also feel like an intense uncertainty or a vertiginous emptiness where nothing really matters. But it's this suspension of affects that happens in affective eruptions. These, okay, as I told you, can be the case with psychedelics, but it doesn't have to be so intense as the one that I'm describing of the vertiginous emptiness or the lightness and the freedom. It can also happen in a much mundane way, as when you do gardening or when you do meditation. Gardening is my new hobby, that's why I'm going to talk about this. So it doesn't feel like a super specific focus engagement and a freedom or a sense of uncertainty, but what is felt there is that the worries that one has and all the concerns that are so present and so rigid, so to speak, in daily life are suspended for a moment. And this is the kind of affective eruption that we're looking for. These can be good experiences by themselves in the sense that they might, again, open the possibilities for caring in different ways, but they can also go wrong, right? So if there is an opening, there can be, things can go wrong as one takes psychedelics and is not in the right environment and not with the right people. And then some of you, I hope not many of you, know that things go wrong and then you start feeling awful for so many days. So there is an opening that can go right, as it is the case with psychological flexibility, but also can go wrong with these affective eruptions. So they do have an instrumental value, and that's what we want to use with psychological flexibility. And yeah, before I go on, they also, of course, open possibilities of exploration. One might be able to see things that as attractive and to explore things that one didn't even care before. And that happens with these affective eruptions. So let me see. Okay. So this is roughly the idea. So you have these habits, in this case, these affective habits of things that you care about. And then you have the experiences that you can scaffold as by having a ritualistic psychedelic therapy or by gardening, and then you scaffold these eruptions that allow you to choose and be more flexible with your effects and with your cares. Okay. But then these affective eruptions, as I hinted, can go wrong and they might not be enough. So it might be the case that the individual does not have the skills or the material possibilities for actually switching to a more convenient way of caring or affection or way of doing things in their own life. So it might be the case, for example, that there are not enough possibilities to sustain a dignified life. So for example, if one is very sick, or if one is very poor and does not have the means to pay for the basic needs, then despite being able to have an effective eruption, one might not have the possibility to actually switch and then exhibit an actual psychological flexibility, because there is really nothing where to choose, right? A trajectory to choose. It might also be the case that there are not actual possibilities of exploration, that there is no time, or there are no environmental affordances that allow for exploration. And it might be also the case that the person does not have the repertoire, or and the community that the person is does not have the repertoire to express and reframe certain emotions. So there is really not a way of expressing emotions in a different way. So here I'm thinking I have a friend that works with young men in prison, very young, like teenagers in prison. And she was telling me that one of the things that she noticed with them is that the effective experiences that they have are very poor, in the sense that they don't have the expressive tools to name them, to show what they're feeling, or to cope with what they're feeling beyond violence, right? And then here, although they might have effective eruptions by using psychedelics, there is not a real possibility of being psychologically flexible, because it's not a way of choosing otherwise, right? So the second element that we want to defend, that is part of psychological flexibility, is that the right affected possibilities should be available, or then one should be effectively open to build them, because of course not all the possibilities are always there. One part of being flexible is also to build them. So the possibilities that are good for life, what we would like to do now to procure to ourselves a better life, can vary widely, of course. So for example, if I move to China, it might be a very good idea to at least being able to read Chinese, so my life will be better, and then it will contribute to my life. But this is not exactly psychological flexibility. What we want to see here is the affective component of this disposition to learn and engage with this, to build possibilities that might be better for us. Okay, so we want to say that the second element of psychological flexibility is being effectively open to building forms that are good for life. And what is good for life is what fosters one's autonomy and others' autonomies, coming back to the notion of well-being that I said at the beginning, that one good life is one in which one can be autonomous in the environment one lives in. So this is the idea, which what I want to finish, and let me unpack it a bit, because there are many words there. So it's important to understand what it means to foster one's and others' autonomy. So here, an individual autonomy refers to the individual's abilities that satisfy, again, the physiological needs and the needs as a citizen. And again, this is not an agent in isolation. It's an agent that is part of a community, is part of social practices, and is an embodied agent that it's precarious and needs to have a shelter, to have food, to have love, and to have social relationships, right? So autonomy here refers to the relation of mutuality between the skills of the person and the environment in which this person lives, that allows the person to continue having the identity this person wants to have, right? That's why autonomy is realized in interaction with others in one community, and in interaction with the environment, and is constantly exercised. Otherwise, there is a risk of decaying for the individual, right? So to foster these autonomies, what I meant is minimally not to harm the possibilities of the others to maintain their autonomy. The most radical way of harming another person's autonomy is, of course, doing physical damage, but one can do as well this by making places that are inaccessible to people in wheelchairs, right? So is a way of harming the autonomy of people that needs wheelchairs to move. So I minimally mean that to not harm the other's possibility of maintaining their own autonomy, but it can also be more positive in the way that when you interact with others or when you do interventions to design the environment, you might open more possibilities for other people, right? So it might happen in a conversation with a friend or in a conversation with a colleague that the building of the conversation opens other possibilities of research, for example, or of understanding your life. And this is being captured already by the concept of participatory sense making. This is what I'm referring here to. Okay, so so that's what I meant by fostering one's and other autonomies. So what we want to have is that there is some sort of building this, and for this to happen, this is an interactive and a social task. And coming back to the talk that Melina, to what Melina was telling us in her talk, we don't want to impose what we understand as autonomy. Like, I do understand that for autonomy, it's very important to have a garden. Of course, that's my understanding, but I don't want to impose this over the others. And that's why it's very important that there is this opening for building with the others and to listening what the others want, how the others want to build their own lives, right? And so finally, so the last element of this idea is that by being psychologically flexible, we're effectively open to do that, to do all these ideas that I've been explaining. So this affective openness can be understood as a meta affectivity, in the sense that it's a disposition or a mood to, an affective disposition or a mood to feel with others and to be with others and to be sensitive to the ways in which autonomies can be harmed. Of course, we're not always sensitive to that. We might engage in habits and in things that, well, caring about things that might be harming for our autonomy and that might be too rigid, because we sometimes do not have this affective openness. So as this is the case when with OCD, for example, to make a very extreme case in which all the other possibilities of affection are ignored. But okay, so by psychological flexibility, we refer to this general mood of being open and being open to build and being open to change, right? This affectivity can be also can become manifest and can become more specific when the situation calls for it. So for example, when you feel anger or indignation or courage, you're moved to act, and you're moved to act because you're responding to see that somebody's autonomy is being harmed, right? So is the feeling of injustice or the feeling of you yourself being harmed, or your loved ones or your friends. And then here we have the affective openness to be called to action and to be moved to be with the other, a solution that makes, that restores their autonomy. These affections can be scaffolded too, right? As we saw with the case of psychedelic experiences, one can have this form of affectively openness to be with others through aesthetic collective experiences, right? So, one example of an affective collective experience in which there is some sort of affective eruption is, for example, going to a concert in which people are like together feeling full of possibility, let's say, and affective, and having this affective suspension of normal life. But there might be ways in which this openness is also open to building new forms of caring. So this is the case with as many of you might know, there is a history of internal conflict in Colombia, and then many of the women that come from the inner parts of Colombia and the more violent parts of Colombia are survivors of many forms of violence, right? So there is a group of women that started meeting very often to quilt and to do quiltings that are able to tell their stories and to reframe them and to give them a new affective meaning. Here we have both some sort of affective eruption, in the sense that when you're invested creating together with somebody, the other affectivities that are there that might be traumatic are suspended for a moment. But there is also a way in which there is some participatory sense making in which these experiences are reframed in a different way, right? And this is an example of psychological flexibility that is being scaffolded in a collective, in a shared practice, in aesthetic practice, that allows them to build with others, other forms of engaging with their own past and with their own histories that are better for their own autonomies, right? So here, both the elements of the individual as being open and the environment that allows for let me see, that allows from a safe space in which affective meanings are built, are indispensable for psychological flexibility. So the idea that I started with, that it's so common nowadays of psychological flexibility as being a trait that individuals have, is not so accurate. We do need, of course, the possibilities of building together with others and the possibility of choosing things that are better for our interactive autonomies, right? So, okay, so that was the last idea that I wanted to finish. And here is a summary of what I just said. So the idea, the take-home message, and the idea that we're, again, working on is that psychological flexibility is good insofar it contributes to people's well-being. And we define it as a matter, first, of scaffolding affective eruptions that allows one to build, to choose from different trajectories that are better for one's autonomy and for others' autonomies in interaction, but also is a matter of having affective openness to build with others trajectories that are better for people's autonomies. And that's it. Thank you very much.
We will have 10 students.
Thank you, Laura. Very interesting presentation. Well, it's just a curiosity. In my time, a long time ago, when I was studying psychology, we worked with children that came from these towns, well, in Colombia, the same place, that came to Bogota because of the violence in their own places. And in that time, I think 15 years ago, my faculty created a ludoteca playground for these kids. And we provide food and care, but also we try to evaluate the psychological implications of these experiences, because, well, very hard experiences. And in that time, we used the concept of resilience, and based on this positive psychology, because it was very interesting, and I think maybe it's related with what you are saying, and maybe I would like to know if that is connected, if you know if this concept could be connected with psychological flexibility, because the experiences and in these evaluations through drawings and playing with kids, well, very specific batteries of evaluation, we found that those kind of strategies that you said are part of this psychological flexibility. But in those days, we talked about resilience. So it was just curiosity. What do you think about that?
I think resilience is still being used, still sort of trendy. And I do think, actually, when I think of this, I think of resilience as coinciding, if not perfectly, then very much, with affective openness to build. So I think resilience, it's more focused on this building when there are no more opportunities, whereas psychological flexibility might encompass also the experience of just having a switch in the possibilities that you already have, right? So it is an open question, but my intuition is that resilience is the affective openness part of psychological flexibility. But yeah.
And you know what? In that time, we knew that there are some cultural scaffoldings, maybe, or I don't know, that are related with that resilience, because the parenting guidelines are part of they're very cultural. Like, for instance, we have our paisas, the people from Medellin or from Antioquia that came to Bogota because of the violence, but the indigenous people and the Afro-Colombian people, and we can identify the differences between the strategies parents use for resilience in that time. So I think it's interesting to see how all of these different cultural differences are helps them to cope with all this suffering. So
but it's also not only about cultural difference, but also about the ways that the skills that we are taught to express our emotions and to give meaning to certain situations that are not easy in our lives, right? Then I'll guess that you can find not only cultural difference, but also gender difference. That, for example, women are told that it's okay for us to cry, for example, which might be a tool that is not so available for others. Yeah, but I think it is an open question to see what are these skills that are built in development and parenting.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. Okay. I have a question about responsibility. What about that? For example, in positive psychology, everything it's about your own responsibility and your volition, and I like that you are like going beyond that idea. But I want to know, in your explanation, what is the role that plays responsibility?
Yeah, I would say that you're right, that in psychological psychology, you have this constant individual responsibility for their own feelings, right? And their own ways of responding to a situation and dealing effectively with a situation. But here, the idea of responsibility becomes much more mutual, in the sense that you are not only caring about yourself, but you're caring about all the community and the things that make your autonomy possible, right? So I wrote about this with another colleague, and we would say that the responsibility is much more focused on the implications on autonomy and your own autonomy and the other's autonomy, rather than on how you have this discrete instance of feeling or dealing with a situation. Then this implies that you will have responsibilities in places where usually you don't see them, as when you do interventions in the environment, when you perpetrate certain practices that are harmful for other people, because you do have this other sort of responsibility, right? But then there is some environmental responsibility, so to speak, in the sense that there is something inherently wrong in practices that go against some kinds of autonomies, as the case of autistic people that you were talking about, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
It's Laura. So I'm wondering how to think about this in relation to addiction, where there's overly rigid habits. And so you're describing ways in which we can structure our environments through activities like gardening, for instance, that could help to shift a person out of these rigid attractors. Yeah, that's the story that you just told. So, but one way to think about what autonomy means here. So I guess my question is, what do you mean by autonomy? The habits that form in addiction are examples of autonomous of autonomy for the sensory motor body. So there's still autonomy there that's in place in addiction. So how are we to think about the fostering of autonomy in a way that would get somebody out of those sorts of behaviors that are bad for their well-being, like forms of addiction? The fostering of autonomy doesn't seem like it's the concept that's going to do the work of understanding how to shift somebody out of a behavior that's detrimental to their well-being.
Yeah, so
I mean, you can think of an addict as somebody that is incredibly autonomous in some ways. You know, they're leading a lifestyle that they want to lead, and it might not be good for them, but there's still autonomy there. So the fostering of autonomy, I'm not sure if that's the notion that you need here to unpack how psychological flexibility is contributing to well-being.
yeah, so well, maybe what I need is the fostering of people's well-being. But what I want to say about the case of the addict is that it might be autonomous with respect to the habit of whatever addiction this person is having, right? But there are other normative frameworks in which this autonomy is going worse and worse and worse, like the bodies, if it's going against one's health, as when one smokes, for example, and it's also going against the autonomy of the person as a citizen, as a worker, as somebody that may have had some other aspirations of becoming, I don't know, a philosopher maybe. Then it's not completely, it is right that it's fostering the autonomy, but not the autonomy of the person as a whole, but the autonomy of the addiction there. So one of the things that are like underneath all what I've said is that I think that the notion of autonomy in activism really needs to be more explicit and to be more open to these many layers of autonomy that are there, and to the fact that autonomy requires changing interaction, in the sense that the environment changes and then identities might change, right? So maybe there is not sufficient emphasis on this character of autonomy, and in the fact that a person's autonomy is a diverse thing that is part of many different systems rather than just one system, right? So that's why I still like this idea of fostering people's autonomy, if you see it as a complete multifarious.
Okay, so now I understand why you write plural autonomies, because you want to stress that there are multiple bodies, and it's important to think about autonomy in relation to each of these dimensions of identity.
Yeah, exactly. And you belong to different practices that make you who you are, and this variety of being part of many different practices is what makes you an autonomous person and a flexible person, right? That contributes to well-being. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Somebody else wants to ask? No? I will just following up this question because I just thought about it. So would there be a possibility of being a double disruption in the same time? Like I think, for example, like a particular situation, like one becoming transsexual, for example, and you being in your autonomy with the correct people that allow you to be this transsexual person. But then, for example, you meet your parents in a moment, no? You meet them in the supermarket, to say something. No?
Yeah.
So there's like a double, no? Like you have to behave for the family and for the friends at the same time.
Yeah.
It's just a follow-up because I just thought, no, like an example like that.
Yeah, so I think that would be a case of an affective eruption in the sense that this person is switched to present themselves in a different way, right? So there is an eruption there in the sense that there is some switching. I would say that there is a conflict between frames of normativity that constitute this person's autonomy, right? So you have the frame of the person being part of this family and having whatever values that go against being a transgender person, and then the other identity. And then it's a moment in which these normativities, so to speak, crash, and there is a tension here. This tension is possible because there is a body that belongs to different practices, and then it's a clash that doesn't know how to resolve. We tend to want to resolve these conflicts, of course, and for that, I would say that you might need, again, psychological flexibility to find a way of building, or even to decide that there is no way of building a relationship there, right? But yeah, so I think that's an example that includes both eruptions and also normative frameworks that are in conflict for the same person and the same body. Okay, well, thank you.
Okay, Laura. And Julian's comment made me think a little bit more about it, about the difficult of thinking about the autonomy in referring to a whole person, because I think I cannot remember like a definition of autonomy referring like to a whole person, because we are talking most of all of microidentities referring to microworlds. That it's probably what these models are intending to explain. And I think like when we talk about this more explicit identity that we normally refer to, it's much more like a narrative, like we have, I don't remember if I think somebody from the next approach said, but I remember Gallagher like making reference to this idea. So it's like I don't know, it's like the same sort of identity, like we can define as in the same way of autonomous. And well, that makes me like hard to think about this psychological solutions. Also, I think it makes sense to me about talking about this flexibility, but I don't know if you have some
So
ideas.
I do think that it's a bit confusing to talk about autonomies like different microidentities when we are the same person, right? And then trying to come up with a second layer of trying to integrate this. So my intuition here, and again, it's like underneath of all what I've said, is that part of your autonomy is being able to switch from these different normative frameworks that make you who you are. And we want to have the exploration and the diversity for being able to synchronize with those, right? So I don't know, maybe for a notion of autonomy that is more useful for us to understand what we want from ethical questions and for political questions and for psychological questions is one that captures the idea that we're not extremely compartmentalized people with different autonomies and habits that become autonomous, but that we are navigating by different flows of habits and different flows of normativity. That's the idea behind. And also, I do think that the notion of having a narrative self, having a narrative self can be useful to in some stage to have this affective eruption and then to think of yourself in a meta sense and what do I want to do with my life. But I do think that the cohesion of self does not necessarily come from the narratives, but from the body. But that's besides the point, I guess. Okay, well, thank you. That's it, right? Gracias por preguntarme cosas, queridos amigos. Que gracias por preguntarme cosas, por hacerme preguntas.
Come across to the promised land. Ya cuando me digas tú, Melina. Cuando me digas tú.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we are going to listen to Vicente Raja. Welcome, Vicente, back to Mexico. Go.
Thank you. I'm super happy to be here again. I was here right before the pandemic, or kind of a few months before, and it was super fun, and I'm super happy to be here again. So today I'm going to tell you a few tales about brains and behavior. And I have two caveats first. The first one is that this is a paper I'm writing with Tony, and this is the first time Tony is going to see it. So I hope after that he doesn't drop out from the paper. This is one thing. The other thing is that I arrived in here on Monday from Spain. I woke up like at 4:30 a.m. Today. So I'm like hanging out, like there. Let's see. Everything is ready for this to be a disaster, but I'm gonna try to do it in the proper way. A good disaster, at least. So yeah, I'm going to tell you a few tales, two tales actually, about the brains and behavior. And if this title is not very informative, what I'm going to try to do actually is something like a radical embodied cognitive neuroscience that includes social stuff. So what I'm going to try to say is that radical embodiment provides a framework for cognitive neuroscience that allow us to incorporate behavior, including social behavior in the field. So to do so, first I'm going to illustrate the overall idea of my point with two comparisons: Weber contra Müller and William James contra Helmholtz. After that, I hope you will say so far so good, and then I'm going to say so what. Then I'm going to tell you the two tales. One of them is I call it the computer tale, and the other one is the radical embodied tale. And in the end, I'm going to talk about how to include the social scale in the radical embodied tale with two key concepts, which are informations and constraints. So let's start with Weber contra Müller, James contra Helmholtz. So, as you know, Johannes Müller was probably the most important physiologist of the 19th century, and for sure, the most important neurophysiologist. He's famous for many things, but he famously developed the doctrine of the specific energies of nerves that basically says that the quality of our sensations depends on the character of the different nerves and not on stimulation, right? So the fact that you feel touch or you sense a flavor or you see a color depends on the qualities of the nerves themselves and not of the qualities of the stimuli that irritates those nerves. Okay, so like that's why a metal ball feels heavy in your hand and tastes metally in your mouth, right? So not everybody agreed with that, and Weber, the famous developer, not the famous influence for Wegener to develop the Weber's law, right? Didn't like that. And Boring, who is one of the most important historians of experimental psychology, put it in a very beautiful way. He claims that Weber's position is something like, if a metallic rod gives rise to pressure on the nerve of touch and to taste on the nerve of taste, still there is no reason to believe that this distinction occurs for any other reason that the rod is sapid as well as heavy. No one is surprised because a lump of sugar on the skin arouses pressure, right? So the point here, this can be interpreted in many different ways. The way I want you to look at it is that there are non-nervous properties or properties that don't belong to our physiology that may be relevant for our sensations. Here is that I'm going to change this wording, but so far I'm going to still say there's something outside there that can influence what is inside. And I think the same happens with when William James attacks Helmholtz's theory of spatial perception. Helmholtz's theory basically say that we infer unconsciously, the famous unconscious inference, right? We infer spatial relations like distance, position, and that kind of stuff from non-spatial sensations. That's, you know, we get some input that has no spatial qualities, and we reconstruct the space from them. One more time, James doesn't like this, and he asks, why is it possible? And he says this, which is also beautiful. Say how it might be asked, can association produce a space quality not in the things associated? One more time, not a property that is not in the rod or is not out there, right? How can we, by induction or analogy, infer what we do not already generically know? Can suggestions of experience reproduce elements which no particular experience originally contained? He says in the end, no theory is worthy of the name which leaves such a point obscure. Well, Helmholtz does so leave it. And he even accuses him that at one time, he seems to fall back on inscrutable powers of the soul. So he's pointing to that, how can we have sensations or perception of a space if there's no such a thing that we get from whatever is outside, right? He goes on and says, if there be such things as sensations at all, then so surely as relation between objects exists in rerum natura, so surely and more surely do sensations exist to which these relations are known. So he thinks that relations between things are not built up inside our brains, but are given in sensation. Again, there's something out there that is constituting our experience. By the way, I think that you can trace Gibson's project from this, exactly this thing, right? What are the structures out there that can be given? So basically, the point here, or I think the point that these two long quotes illustrate is that in the constitution of our experience, not everything is physiology, right? That we should include things that are outside physiology. And I think that for some of us, or for most of us here, to that claim, you will say, so far, so good. And now I'm going to ask, so what? But first, so far, so good, so what is a Megadeth album, a very good Megadeth album that you should listen to. But if you listen to Megadeth, you actually have to listen to Rust in Peace, which is arguably the best thrash metal album ever. And I can take questions about that in the Q&A if you want. But other than that, listen to Megadeth. So far, so good, because most of us agree that there are important outside of the brain factors to explain cognition writ large, right? But what does it mean for the neuroscience we want to do? So how can we integrate those factors in our scientific activity as cognitive neuroscientists? My main thesis in here is that the ecological and the social scales are just one further explanatory scale of neuroscience. And what does it mean? Or what I mean about this, that most neuroscientists agree that the brain is a multi-scale system that can actually be studied at different scales, at the molecular scale, single neuron, neural networks, neural regions, systems. My only claim is that you only have to put one more scale on top of that, which is the organism environment scale, which is not an outside And that's how we will go to that way. It's not an outside, it's a further scale of the whole system, right? So that's the main claim, that we need to put another scale on top of the scales that we or that cognitive neuroscientists already accept. And I think that radical embodiment gives us a better way to put that scale on top of the other ones. And now is when I'm going to talk about details. I'm going to first tell you the computer tale, which I think doesn't deal well with the ecological and social scales, and then the radical embodied tale that I think deals well. So the computer tale. To tell you this tale, I'm going to use only one narrative device, which is the idea of motifs or motives, right? That are non-strict guidelines, but more like somewhat vague patterns that support open-ended families of explanations. So what do I mean by motives? I'm thinking about musical motives. Right? There are patterns that are somehow stable, but depending on in which song you put them, they sound different. The pattern is there, but it's not exactly the same thing. Let me illustrate this with a video. I'm sorry, it's in Spanish, but there's the translation there. Is like 40 seconds, right? Let me see.
Los motivos son como las unidades mínimas con significado. Uno de los motivos del tema del lado de los cisnes es el motivo de la escala ascendente. Eso es una
The motive
propia, con significado.
that you can move.
Lo bajo podría componer un tema distinto.
The upper scale is
El tema del lado de los cisnes
right? Another one.
tiene este motivo. Con el que a lo mejor Mozart podría componer otro tema diferente.
See? So these motifs are just a pattern that kind of have a meaning, right? A very vague meaning that can be used in different ways. Make sense? Yeah? So my point is that we can study all the frameworks, say Gestalt, behaviorism, cognitive psychology, or cognitive neuroscience, not as frameworks that give strict guidelines of what things mean, but give you a few motives for a few things. And the motive can be interpreted in different ways. For instance, to me, the notion of representation is such a motive. So it means something like there's something in one place that stands for something in other place. But the very details of what that means depend on the song you put them, right? Fodor means something about that. Poldrack means a slightly different thing, where the only thing that you carry is this kind of structure of a thing that stands for other thing, but can mean different things. So one benefit of the motives and not the strict guidelines, motives can take all the punches, right? You can take the details of the representation when the language of thought falls down. You can still carry the motive with you to a different theory, right? So my point is that all these theories or all these frameworks, better, have motives for basically main topics like what is the relationship between stimuli and sensation? How do we deal with the localization versus holism debate about where cognitive functions are? Or what is the main mechanism of experience? What's the scope of our science, right? If you are a behaviorist, you will think something like the scope of our science is overt behavior, and that's it, right? If you are a different kind of psychologist, you might think that experience also is part of the science you wonder. So I think, for instance, that cognitive neuroscience has a motive that gives you guidelines or gives you these vague patterns to understand the relationship between stimuli and sensations. And the motives are that we are input-output systems and that we encode things, or the brains encode something, right? All right, how you take input and output be, or what kind of coding do you use that? If it is efficient coding, predictive, or any other kind, well, that's a different thing. The motive itself is that you encode something, right? So I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to focus in these two motives, in the motives of input and output and the motive of the algorithm as the main mechanism for the cognitive stuff. So that gives you a tale in which a cognitive system is an input-output system that gets stimulation and delivers behavior. And importantly, this is the important part, right? The thing that is doing the cognition, so to speak, is that part. And then whatever algorithm fits here, it's a matter of what your theory is. Is it active inference? Is it a kind of Bayesian brain? Is a different kind, non-Bayesian system? No matter what, it's just an algorithm there in an input-output system, in which the input is kind of the material. The cognitive system is the maker itself, you know, the thing that makes the important thing, and the behavior is output. And that's what you get. And you can see that this is a consequence of the input-output motif, because the input can be simple stimulation, more complex patterns. You can see if you review a cognitive neuroscience paper, the stimulus sometimes is one wavelength that triggers the activity of some ganglion cell in the retina, and other time is a clip of the movie Memento. So whatever the input is not that important. The motif itself is that there's an input, whatever it is, right? But it's also a consequence of the motive of the algorithm. What we need to know, what explains what the cognitive system does, is whatever the algorithm is doing. This is material input, and this is output. We don't really care about what is going on here, right? So I think this kind of computer tale puts the ecological and the social scales always in the non-important part, always in the outsides, right? A stimuli is whatever you get to do the important thing, which is to build up the internal model of the world. Like whatever you see other people doing is just the input that you get to build up your theory of mind, right? And actually, behavior is just whatever is made by the cognitive system itself. If you've read, I think it's the last Cecilia Hayes book, is called Cognitive Gadgets. And basically it says, you know, even all the social stuff and all the cultural stuff are gadgets that we somehow have here, and they produced the stuff. So culture itself is somehow in the brain, and the material part is just the product of it, right? So I think that when you frame cognitive systems, and when your approach to cognitive science is based in these motifs, you get into a place similar to this one, with some differences here and there. Some people say, no, but there's a loop here, right? Still in the outsides, but there's a loop there. But I think this kind of tale with these motifs frames the ecological and the social scales, not as further scales to be integrated in what we already take to be scales of the cognitive system, but like material to model and consume in order to deliver a product. So I think that when you frame cognitive neuroscience like that, it's difficult to include the social because it stays in the periphery always. So allow me to tell you a different tale that I think fits better, or that help us to fit the social better in the cognitive neuroscience we want to do. Of course, I think the radical embodied tale has its own motifs, and importantly, these are as vague patterns as the other ones, right? I'm not claiming that cognitive neuroscience is vague and we are super cool. No, you know, like we have things for the relationship between stimuli and sensations. We have not an input-output system, but an organism environment nesting. But nesting means, you know, different things for different people. We have invariants, but that for some people are not that invariant, but still work. And we have Gestalt there, right? Or for experience, I think the mechanism should be something like resonance. Some other people say attunement. Some other people say sensory motor coupling. They are a family of things, that patterns that are similar but not exactly the same, right? So I'm going to do the same. I'm going to focus instead of the input-output in the nesting one, and instead of the algorithm in the resonance one, because it's the name I use for this motif here. So this is an attempt to do a figure as cool as Melina had, but it's not a school, I'm sorry. But what you basically have is an organism environment system that includes everything already, right? It has the natural and the social there. And then you have nested system within it. And I highlight here the neural system. But there are other systems. You can be interested in biomechanics or in sports, and the system you want to highlight here is the muscular skeletal one for some reason, right? And of course, this is one neural system. This organism environment system is populated of this scale of these neural scales nested in it, right? And it's, you know, I want to say I don't want to say that some scales are more important. I think science has aims, and depending on your aims, different scales can do the trick. I'm interested in cognitive neuroscience, so my scales are the organism environment one and the neural one. Some other people can be interested in other things. And importantly, there's not an inside-outside relationship here. It is difficult to depict that, because you might think that this is outside the neural system, but no, the neural system is a scale within this scale, so to speak, right? So what we want to know is if, remember, cognitive neuroscientists accept scales, molecular, single neuron, neural network systems, how to relate the last one, how to put this other scale, how to do this multi-scale thing, right? And I think that from a radical embodied point of view, we want that basically that, what I said, no, that this scale features in the explanation of a radical embodied cognitive neuroscience. In some ways, to use all words that we shouldn't use, is to regard the outsides as important as the insides, right? This echoes in some ways a sentence, a claim by Tolman that I like a lot. Tolman used to claim that for a physiology to explain a psychology, we need first a psychology to explain, right? So that's it, to know what's the relationship between scales, or between the insides and the outside, or between the neural scale, or how the neural scales contributes to the organism environment scale. We need to know what is going on in this scale too, right? So, right. And I think the motives the radical embodied tale give us to this are the motives of information and resonance. And I'm going to focus on them. What is information? This is if you are within the ecological community, this is a sensitive topic. So I'm trying to be I think most people can accept this definition. It's whatever is stable, not specific, right? Not fully random, but somewhat stable, so that can be used in similar situations. Whatever stable pattern of stimulation generated at the organism environment scale. So between the organism and for instance, if it is visual information, the light that surrounds us and reflects from the surfaces of the environment, and the organisms can use to guide its action writ large too, right? So examples of these are, for instance, there's a very recent paper by Mathis et al. That show that there are some stable patterns of a very complex octave flow, but they're stable when we walk around and when we hike. So they basically got people hiking with two cameras in the eyes and one in the head, right? So they were trying to study what kind of optic flow they got while they walk around. And unsurprisingly, the patterns of flow are not this kind of idealized ones that we say they expand like that. No, there's very complicated patterns. But even in those complicated patterns, they were able to find two properties: the divergence of the flow, that is something like the expansion in this way, and the curl, that is the expansion in this way, that are kind of stable and are related to the heading and to the head position and that stuff. So are the patterns that they get of light when it gets to their eyes, right? And there are mathematically complicated, right, but still kind of stable patterns of that flow that organisms can use reliably on similar situations to do that kind of thing. That's what we mean by information, is to redescribe stimulation such that we find invariant or sufficiently stable patterns that can support the control of behavior. Another example is a very recent paper by Tsao and Tsao. I'm a super fan of this one. For those of you familiar with the ecological jargon, I think they prove mathematically that there's information in the optic flow for the occluding edge. They basically say that if you take light as an structure, which is what in the ecological approach is called the optic array, there's information to distinguish objects when one is in front of the other, and that's object segmentation. So they say that in that patterns you can see edges. There are two edges here, right? One of them is the edge between the label and the apple, and the other edge is between the apple and the banana there. So one edge belongs to the same object, but the other edge separates objects. So if there's information, so to speak, out there in the structure of light, to do this, you have the information you need for object segmentation without needing an internal model of the environment that simulates the objects and move. And they actually find there is, as you allow for more than one snapshot. So as soon as you allow for a little bit of action, you see that the edges that belong to the same thing are diffeomorphic, which is a property of differential topology, blah blah blah. While the other kind of edge is diffeomorphic to one side but not to the other side. So there's a property of the structure of light as you move that gives you this thing, right? And of course, it's a fucking hell, right? It's very, very complicated mathematically, but again, you can redescribe the input, so to speak. We don't like inputs, but you can redescribe a stimulation such a way that what James said, if there are relations out there, we have to get relations in the sensation too. So if there are objects, different objects out there and edges between them, we should get something in sensation too, right? So these are examples of information. Again, they are kind of stable patterns that might break down sometime, right? There might be that at some point you do object segmentation wrong, right? But these are stable things out there, right? And one more time, this is a redescription of the organism environment scale of the information available in the energy arrays like light, sound that surround us. This is not inside us, right? But how it, so to speak, how it gets inside us. It's not inside. Remember, no side, no inside. But it's. I have to say something. So here is resonance. What happens here, my claim, is resonance. That means that suppose that you are in an organism environment system event like a baseball player. How the baseball player knows when to hit the ball that it approaches? Well, everything that approaches to your eyes expands in your visual field. So if you take a hand, when it moves closest to your eyes, it looks bigger. Same with any object, right? So there's a property of the optic flow that is a kind of mathematization of it that is called tau. We don't care about what tau is. We just care that it's like the object segmentation thing or like the divergence and cool is a property, a redescription of the input of a stimulation, such thus is a stable pattern that a baseball player can reliably use in most situations to do this, right? So what resonance says is that if when you describe the organism environment dynamics, you find tau, when you look to the brain dynamics, you must find tau. In a more technical way, if a dynamical model that accounts for a behavior, like hitting a ball, includes a perceptual variable, tau, that perceptual variable, tau, must be found in the dynamics of the brain activity. For instance, in some relevant parts of your EEG data. So this is the theoretical point, right? Is that once you redescribe this scale in terms of dynamics and information, you can look at this scale in terms of dynamics and information. So you put the ecological scale and the neural scale in the same language. And we have actually done that. We have done that with kids, with tau, with babies actually, with tau outside and tau in their brains. I'm not going to focus on it. And we have also data for interception experiments when we ask people to bring this dot to this goal when the car is here, and we find the same kind of thing. We find that when you can describe the organism environment dynamics in terms of tau, you find tau in the motor cortex, in the visual cortex. It is coupled to the movement of the hand. It is coupled to the tau of the car. So you are able to look to the two different scales with the same words, thanks to information, thanks to the motives of the radical embodied tail. So there are important things here. First, notice that we start talking about the organism environment scale. So we identify information at the behavioral scale, at the ecological scale. And then we look for that one in the neural scale. So we don't take the organism environment scale as a product. We take it as a substantive scale that we have to really understand what information is there, what dynamics are going on there, to then look how the brain can contribute to that. If a physiology is to explain psychology, we first need a psychology to explain, right? And we can do that because the motives of the radical embodied tail allow us to put all these things in the same language. It's not the outside with some rules and the inside with other rules. It's all dynamics and information and coupling between a scale. And you can add other ways to look to these relationships there in terms of complexity, fractality, etc. Right? And importantly, as I said, it's an ongoing research field, right? I'm a philosopher, or like Tony says, a 51% of a philosopher, but we are doing experimental work with this, right? It's not just me hand waving. It's a little bit more. But if we summarize the radical embodied tail, what I'm trying to say that informations and resonance, and remember, these are motives. You might want to say something like sensory motor contingencies and attunement, and it could work similarly, right? Allow for the main thesis, the ecological and the social are just one more scale that is actually described in the same language as all the other ones. And it's quite straightforward in simple sensory motor tasks. There are some organism environment dynamics and some neural dynamics, two different scales. You explore the organism environment dynamics to find information, and then you find how the neural scale resonates to that. So far, so good. You explore the organism environment dynamics to find information. How could that work with the social, right? I've been telling you about hitting a ball, the hand, and the flow here. How can we do this with social norms? Can we find them? So let's talk about it. If you are on board, at least for the sake of the argument, that with information and resonance, we have the tools to add this further scale to our practices as researchers in cognitive neuroscience. What would it mean to have not just the natural ecological scale, but the social one too? That's the key question, and this the one that I don't have a really good answer for, but I'm going to try to think. So I think one natural question here is that do we have, so to speak, social information as we have natural ones? So do we have stable patterns of information in the social events in the same way we have for walking around? So one thing to think about is that walking around is a social event. The last time I was here, I based my whole talk on the Lord of the Rings. This is kind of a quote. I'm quoting myself, so self-reference. Anyway, so sometimes, I mean, walking is a social event in many ways. We walk socially loaded environments, right? And sometimes we walk together. Like today, we went to one place together, and we came here. And I was, for instance, following Melina because she knows where we were going to go. So me and Tony and Julian and other people were following her. So actually, if you remember, Tony has been talking about God, Warren, and Fagan on this heading model, right? This if you were here this morning, the long equation that he put there with the goal and the obstacle. So Bill Warren have also shown that there's visual information for human flocks. So for when people work together, there are kind of clear information about steering and is steering and speed. And it has to do with the different angles between the people that surround you. Suppose that the people that surround you are a Markov blanket, and then so you only need some local rules with them for this event, social event, working together to happen. So I want to claim that there's at least sometimes it's possible to have information for social events that is similar to the kind of sensory motor information. But of course, everyone here is going to tell me, yeah, you know, that you are talking about, still are talking about the control of navigation in an environment with some other obstacles, which are people, right? But in this kind of social events of walking together, you know, there's someone that leads and someone that follows. Is there information for the leadership and for the follower? There are also kind of agreements on speed and the path and where we stop, right? Is there information for these agreements? Because maybe human flocks are actually behavior settings too, right? It's not just a sensory motor process between people, it's a behavior setting in which we all build up something. And I'm going to use Harry Heft's definition of what, or one of the definitions of what a behavior setting is. That is, regions in the community could be characterized as emergent, dynamic structures. So, okay, human flock is emergent, dynamic, right? Constituted by interdependent joint actions, that's good too, among individual and features of the material environment, considers over some extended period of time. So I think, to me, a human flock counts as a behavior setting, given this. Importantly, I know that Harry Heft thinks they don't. And Harry Heft is the person I know who knows more about behavior settings, so I guess I'm wrong, but I'm still going to hold that this is a behavior setting. Other kinds, we have been talking about them, right? A classroom is a behavior setting that has all these things. Might have information of the sensory motor kind, so to speak, but also, you know, agreements and norms and etc. A flight, a soccer game with the best player right now, Vinny Jr. Anyway, the thing is that I think we all can agree that behavior settings are part of the organism environment scale. They don't happen inside our head, they are outside. Not outside, but they are there, right? And if things like human flocks are behavior settings, there's some sense in which you can find information there, right? Like the one Bill Warren found. But there are some other things, as we have said, agreements, leadership, followers. There are other constraints that actually enable many times that setting happens. So today there were constraints that Melina was the leader of our human flock that actually enabled that we arrived here, right? That kind of thing. And these, so are these constraints information? I would say no, actually. But I would say that a way to start understanding the social scale is to think about information whenever possible, and might be some in some behavior settings that you have some of its information, but you also need constraints, social norms, canonical actions, legal limits. Like when you fly, there are the rules of aviation, which I don't know, but this is a constraint on what kind of things you can do and don't, right? Mutual recognition, like that is a thing that Julian was talking about. I have to confess, I've been recently defeated by the phenomenology of the spirit. I kind of left halfway through or something like that. I will come back someday. I've been defeated right now. So the question is, let's assume that, or let's think as of constraints not as information but something different. I have a thought there that they can be two sides of the same coin, blah blah. But let's see a different where to find them. And I think you find constraints on the other side of the outsides. If you on the other side of the outsides, quote unquote. When you find information in the stimulus side, if you want to look for the constraint, you have to look at the behavior side. Is in the behavior, is in the dynamics of behavior where you have at least an indirect door towards the constraints affecting it. Let me talk a little bit about it. We have already talked about jazz improvisation and how to jazz players couple to each other when they play together. So in the way they move, this paper says, you can find whether they are playing in time together or not, if they are doing more, let's say, more harmonic stuff or not, right? So it's in their behavior, in the way they move is where you find whether they constrain each other or not. Right? You might not find it in the music actually, but in the behavior. Might not find it in the input, but in the output. Right? So to find information, you have to look at the stimulation, at the input. To find constraints, you have to look at the output. That's what I'm trying to deliver here. The same happens in another paper Tony has been talking today about, which is decomplexity matching in a dyadic conversation. In their behavior, you can see how they constrain each other. So the way they move, the complexity of their behavior is a door to try to understand what constraints are operating in those dynamics. And see how we are, again, talking about dynamics. So it's going to be relatively easy to bring dynamics to the multi-scale system, right? Even more, there's a very recent paper, super good one. It's the embodiment of concealable stigma, this closure through dynamics of movement and language. This is an experiment in which some participants were closing some form, something that they took to be an stigma in some societies, right? You know, some pathology or some condition that they found an stigma, and depending on the setting in which they were disclosing it, like to a person they trust, to the therapist, to other people, you could find if the event of this closure was in a safe environment, or an environment they found more safe or less safe, or what norms were there, if were a therapist, a more formal setting, and that kind of stuff. And you could find those in their movement and language. So again, in their behavior, you can track the kind of behavior setting or the kind of constraints that behavior setting was imposing in them. We still have a further question is that, but we don't really know how those constraints operate in them, right? It's through perception, or is through other things. But you can actually study the so to speak, the fractality of the social realm, the complexity of the behavior in the social realm, to try to identify which are the constraints that are operating there. This is to say that constraints are reflected in behavior. Information is in stimulation, or mostly in stimulation. We can explore the constraints in behavior, in the dynamics of behavior itself. And again, the way these constraints affect behavior, I would say, is open, and I want to be a pluralist here. Sometimes it will be information, but some other time can be conditioning, you know, like you follow a norm because your dad says stop it, right? And after saying stop it a few times, you embody that in the dynamics of your behavior, right? You embody that constraint. That some other times can be indirectly, because you enter into a behavior setting that has some constraints, that, and you go with the flow there, even if you are not aware of what is going on, right? So I think that studying the complexity of behavior is a way to find the constraints that affect it. And I say that, remember, Tony, on Maurice, that's a note for me, but that's a note because I think the experiment by Maurice Lamb that Tony has shown of the pick and move, is pick and place, shows this kind of thing, right? Shows the way they behave given the setting in which they are there. I have to think it's just, I wanted to point it out. But one more time, the complexity of behavior and the way it can be studied, to the way in which its dynamics can be studied to identify constraints, again, put constraints in the same language of dynamics that we can use to add the organism environment scale, the ecological and social scale, as a further scale of cognitive neuroscience. So to wrap up, what I'm saying is that when we want to understand a nested system like this one, and the way the different scales of the system can inform us about, or can inform our science. And if we want to integrate the organism environment scale as a further scale of cognitive neuroscience, along with the other ones, with the systems, the networks, the regions, we have some motifs that radical embodiment give us, right? Nesting, information resonance, constraints. I think with these constraints, we have the tools to convince cognitive neuroscientists of just one thing: add one more scale to your system. I want to thank the Spanish Ministry of Science, the European Union that pays for me to be here, etc., and to my university. Thank you very much. This is my Twitter. Okay, let's talk about Megadeth. Are you dropping out right now?
That's good. Now? Okay, good. Thanks, Vicente. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to pull out. I guess I want to throw some doubt into your assumption or that constraints have to be on the inside.
Have to be on the inside.
Well, you said constraints are not on the outside. You
If,
said information on the outside can.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
If I said that, I didn't mean that. To me, the outside are, so to speak, for the classical, for the computer sale, the outside is this and this, right? This is the inside. I think you find information in here and constraints in here. So constraints are in the outside too, but in kind of in a different place of the outside.
So I guess I'm more interested in the other tail. And and what you seem to be saying to me, and if you weren't saying this, I withdraw my question. You seem to be saying that you find information in one place and constraints in another place.
Kind of that, yeah.
Okay. But I think that you can actually understand information as constraints, right? Because the base case of coupling is informational coupling, which is a kind of constraint. And the mechanical coupling is just a subtype of informational coupling. So I think that if you will accept that couplings are constraints, then you'll find constraints anywhere you find information.
I agree with you, actually. I didn't have this part completely thought out, so I didn't want to put it there. But I was actually talking to Jimena about that. I think they are kind of two sides of the same coin, or they are a very similar coin. That actually, when you even in the Shannon sense, when you receive a new bit of information, you constrain the space of possibilities in the distribution, right? So yeah, I think you are right. But you know, this is our paper, so there's a way there to work out. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hola.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
This has been really interesting. I know about some of the work that goes on in your university about minimal cognition and planned cognition. So maybe I can go to that before, or sorry, after my main question. I think I saw in your table describing the radical embodied tail, DST. Does that stand for developmental systems theory?
No, that
Or what does
that
stand for?
stands for dynamical systems theory.
Dynamic
But
systems.
I understand why you think so. I think there are very, very, very close ties between developmental system theory and
Right.
ecological psychology. There's the work of Amanda Corris, who is
Right.
actually a student of Tony too, and friend of mine, that lays out how they are related, also with an activism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even though DST stands for this other phrase, and as you are saying, there are relations between those two frames. It's interesting to me to notice how important information is for you in this description, because people in that other camp would tend to reject and to recommend that information is not really so important. So precisely because of considerations having to do with, as Oyama said, the ontogeny of information, and those considerations would lead into trying to find alternatives. So I wonder if you have any reaction to that.
Well, this is a deep topic, so I'm going to try to be succinct. So there's actually debate on information, on how to understand it, between Howard Paty and Kelso Tarvey and all these people. And I think you can accept the Kelso way, because to Howard Paty, you have to make a distinction between information and dynamics, and then kind of the information is non-homolonic. I don't know how it is, but it's somewhat stable outside of the dynamics, and then the dynamics kind of use that and do that. While Kelso says that information is in the dynamics themselves, so you can understand the dynamics informationally. This is actually the basis of the free energy principle, right? That you can redescribe dynamical systems in terms of information, right? That said, I see your point that there's the criticism Susan Oyama does to more a kind of Howard Paty way to understand information is important. Actually, within ecological psychology and activism, there are people that have argued that we should move towards a notion of information that is based in use and how we use things and not the things that are out there, right? I think explicitly inspired by Susan Oyama, right? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I see the concern. I think there are ways to save information of that concern. And that actually, I was thinking of Julian when I wrote this. That's why I explicitly can use. Maybe Julian would like to take off the can and say that when in fact uses it, it's when this is a stable thing. But yeah, I see the concern. I use the notion of information as a motive, right? So it is vague enough as to accommodate this kind of thing, and I use information because I work in ecological psychology, and that's the word we use for this kind of stable patterns, right? But we could even agree in a different word for that.
So now, very briefly, to go or to try to connect with the plant cognition related stuff. Many of the schemes that you have shown to us today implicitly assume that you're talking about animals. So no, but
I did it.
No. Still, in the inside, in the traditional sense, you have the neural system.
Oh yeah.
So just because of that, I think this might, you know.
So there's a reason for that. In the traditional one, I think I had actually the cognitive system, right? Not the neural system. And in this one, I'm sorry, I have this one, of course, yes, because I'm trying to talk to cognitive neuroscientists, right? Sure. Which is,
but this is why I was assuming that you'd like to connect to your other line of work, no, with plants. Yeah. So if you were to think about this presentation for an auditorium full of botanists or plant scientists,
yes, I would change.
What would you change or propose to actually address?
I would surprisingly change very little. I would change this wording here, and I would say electrophysiological activity. Actually, plants have a lot of electrophysiological activity, which is equivalent to the activity we see in the nervous system. We are actually doing an experiment of electrophytophysiology, which is basically an EEG for plants. And you put an electrode there and you can see the action potential of plants. We have some data of a tau guided behavior in plants, and we are trying to find tau in the electrophysiological activity. That's why I said that there can be many nested systems here. And if you work with sports, you might want a different one, like the joints, everything. And if you work with plants, if you were here, if we made zoom here, we would find a different system. But I think that in general, for the life sciences, the multi-scale approach holds.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thanks for already introducing the DST question, because that's what's worrying me as well a little bit. So I'm wondering if I can have your theory of resonance without your theory of information. So, and if I can't do that, then how am I going to persuade the neuroscientists to introduce this organism environment social scale into their explanations? So it seems like you've built up a package here where unless you buy into all of the elements, then you're not going to be able to get an ecological or radical embodied cognitive neuroscience. And the thing that worries me is just this idea that the information is in the stimulation, as you put it at one point. So I know you're going to say, well, it's only in there in that it could be potentially used by an organism in its coupling with the environment. But still, the idea that there's information in the stimulation, I think, is a bit worrying if you mean by information about. So the alternative that I would push is that there's no information about without information for an organism.
Yep.
And once you have information for, then you have to have the whole developmental history of how does it come to be that pattern stimulation is information for this individual. So, let's say you follow me in making that move, which I know you're not going to. How would I think about resonance from having that historicized notion of information? How would I then understand what resonance is?
Yeah, so
you'd have to say that there's something in the neural dynamics that has the same kind of history dependence as you see in the organism environment dynamics. So there's that same kind of that you can find the same dynamics at multiple scales.
Yeah, I think you are able to. So yeah, I mean, I was expecting this, so I was expecting this kind of question. So when I say information is in the stimulation, yes, I think there are stable patterns in stimulation that organisms can use to go around, right? And I think that echoes this thing, right? That if there are relations between objects, there are relations in sensation. So we don't get the just, we don't get just meaningless atomic stimulation that we have to kind of give sense to. I think that there are some stable patterns that are meaningful given that there's an organism making use of them, right? So that said, I think that can have a developmental story too. I mean, the experiments that Ruth van der Velde and Audrey van der Meer do with babies show that they kind of, there's a developmental history until they are able to resonate to tau. So they get the same stimulus and they first kind of are attuned to a different pattern, but there's a process until they find the right one, right? Or the one that would help us in that situation. So I don't know. I don't think, for instance, tau is about anything, right? So I don't think tau is always for, is an element of the organism environment system that I'm going to go with Tony now, constrains the dynamics in such a way that the organism is able to do something. But I would agree with that all information is information for. I don't think this is incompatible with a description of the environment in terms of stable patterns that can be used in that way.
But the idea that the stable regularities are information because they can potentially be used. No.
Well, I mean, I
seems
think
like
that,
there's very subtle difference there, but I think it matters.
I think it's because they are used, right? I think there's a consistent experimental work that show that we use that kind of stable patterns, right?
Yeah, but then that takes them away from being in the stimulation to it being the use of them that makes the patterns information. So instead of saying that the stimulation contains the information, you're saying that the constraint is the constraining of the action that's the information.
Yeah.
So it's the use of those patterns that makes them information.
I think
that's a shift from what you have on your slide.
I think the cool thing about motives is that we can accommodate that.
Okay, cool.
Right?
Yeah,
I mean,
true.
In the end, if so to speak, just to say tau, if for object segmentation is this kind of thing, is it because it is in the optic array or because it is used? It's still this pattern, right? So I would be happy both ways. I guess I'm a bad analytical philosopher because of that, but
I couldn't find that in your Apple Music library.
Siri.
Play a radio station or ask for your music on a different app.
She wants me to play Megadeth. Just saying that.
So this is partly a response to Julian and what Vicente should have said and will say in the paper that we're going to write. Is that like Edo and I tried to solve this problem. Ed Baggs and I tried to solve this problem by pointing out that you can talk about information about things in a generic way, right? That doesn't involve use or a particular animal engaging with it. But you can also talk about the information in an Umwelt, which is for a particular animal and is used by a particular animal and is often generated by that particular animal moving through a structured environment. So that's a different sort of answer that maybe would have made Jillian a little less unhappy.
I don't know.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Vicente. Thank you, and thank all of you. Thanks for all the technical support. Thank you so much.